Last time we left off with the great Lázaro Cárdenas, statesman of the 20th century, handing over the Chapultepec castle, a symbol of monarchy and absolute power, to the people of Mexico.
And it marks a moment in which the park becomes what it is today, which is a monument or a space for monuments, depending on how you want to see it, because this wonderful castle goes from being an official part of history to a museum itself. It becomes the Museum of National History, which is what it's still known as today. And it marks the beginning of a new period, which we're still in today, I think, in which Chapultepec becomes a monument unto itself.
But of course, Chapultepec today is a lot more than just the castle and its immediate surroundings. And how does this happen? Well, last time we also left off with Lázaro Cárdenas and the presidents that followed him until recently, moving into a house at the end of what is today known as the first section of Chapultepec Park, moved into Los Pinos. And that made a lot of sense, right? This was the end of the city. And at the end of the city, behind a forest, or at the end of a forest, you can put the house of the president. That makes all the sense in the world. To give you an idea of how small Mexico City once was, and up until not too long ago, the neighborhood where the monument to the revolution is today is known as the neighborhood de la Tabacalera, la Colonia Tabacalera, because it was where the factories where cigars were produced were. That means that it was incredibly far from the city that you could put, all of this horrible infrastructure there. Today, that is considered still part of the historic downtown, right? And by that same logic, the neighborhood of Polanco, which is today one of the hippest, trendiest places to visit, all these fancy restaurants there that people come to visit from all over the world, that is where the city ended in the 1930s. 1937, the Polanco neighborhood, which is today right next to Chapultepec, is developed, but when it's first developed, it's just a bunch of massive mansions surrounded by massive estates.
It's interesting to see how, from a very Marxist historian point of view, this expansion also reflects the evolution of the Mexican industrial economy, right? If in the 19th century and before, that part of the city or that part of the outskirts of the city was reserved for first the Mexica, the Aztec rulers, then the viceregal holiday home, and then finally the royal imperial palace of Maximilian, you can see that by the time the revolution has come and gone and Mexico has started to industrialize, what you see is the expansion of what a good Marxist would call the industrial bourgeoisie. These lands being afforded to people, both in Polanco and then further up the hill in what would become known as Las Lomas. All those spaces were given to people or sold to people on the cheap because they had close relationships with the revolutionary government, and those lands came hand in hand with their industrial and economic prowess.
Indeed, all the lands of modern-day Polanco, of Las Lomas de Chapultepec, were once lands that belonged to the aristocracy of the viceregal era. Then they move on to the hands of the new rich industrialists of the post-revolutionary era. And as these very fancy neighborhoods develop, it makes sense that the park should expand as well. And going back to your first point, Alex, that the city becomes the park becomes a monument unto itself. This expanded version of the first section of the park gets a bunch of additional monuments. Now, the official first section, or the original first section, which is entirely fenced, for those of you who visit Mexico City, you can see the fence that circles the entire park. That includes a ton of monuments, and we have no time, sadly, to go through all of them. But there's a 3-kilometer circle that you can run around in, where you can see some of the most beautiful fountains I have ever seen. You have gifts from the Japanese Empire. You have gifts from Canada. There's all sort of wonderful, wonderful things to see in the park, in that part of the park. But what is still the first section of Chapultepec, outside of the fence, includes some of the best museums in the world. This is the National History and Anthropology Museum, where you can find a lot of the most famous relics of Mesoamerica. The Rufino Tamayo Museum, which is a modern art museum named after the very famous 20th century 20th century painter Rufino Tamayo. And of course, the Museum of Modern Art as well, which is right in front of it, has a very special collection of Mexican artists in general, but most famously of Leonora Carrington, the famous surrealist painter.
But wait, Tavo, you're talking about this first section. How many sections are there actually?
Well, today there are 4, but that's interesting as well because the number of sections has grown as the city has grown. Right? So we started with this first section only being what it today has, the fence. Then that first section is the part with the fence plus the stuff next to it. And then that takes us into 1964, where the second section is developed.
But of course, this expansion was pretty much irrelevant to most people because beyond really just half of the first section, everything was out of bounds. You've got Los Pinos, the presidential residence, which of course was out of bounds for most people, and then the rest, which was mostly just army barracks and closed off land. The half that was accessible to most people in the first section of Chapultepec has all these monuments that you're talking about, but also interestingly, they were very much limited, defined by this expansion that you're talking about, not of buildings themselves, but of the massive roadways that were created to connect the then disparate towns that were in the Valley of Mexico and connect them to turn them into Mexico City, the great cosmopolis that we know today. The 2 main roads on one side being Circuito Interior, the ring road at the center of the city, and then on the far side, on the side of Los Pinos, is El Periférico, the outer ring road, the peripheral ring road, which of course now is in the center of the city because obviously the city has continued to expand. What I always thought was interesting was back in the 2010s, there was a big project to build second floors above big roadways, to double capacity. Of course, that didn't happen. All you got was massive funnel effects. But what was interesting was to see how the second floors, which traversed the entire of Mexico City proper, except for one specific place, and that is right in front of Los Pinos, where it goes underground, so the top layer becomes ground level and the bottom layer becomes a tunnel for a few hundred meters, specifically to protect the president, they said. But also, weirdly and sort of beautifully, it also protected the landmarks themselves because you didn't have this massive big piece of ugly infrastructure completely blocking out the sun from one of the more sightly parts of the city.
And though that was not the intention, that was a beautiful outcome of that decision. But of course, nowadays, Los Pinos is no longer the presidential home. Today you can visit Los Pinos. It's now the cultural center of Los Pinos. And that was a decision made by former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador in 2018. It's one of the first things that he does when he comes into office. And I remember when this happened, I have to accept mea culpa here, that when it happened, I was part of the ranks of those who were very angry at this happening. I jumped into my old man persona and said, this is terrible, we must protect the institutions and the symbols of the institutions. But now that you see it done, I have to say I was wrong. When you think about it, it made absolutely no sense that given that the city had already massively outgrown its original urban planning lines, it made no sense for Los Pinos to be where it was. Right? You have the president of the country living in a place entirely surrounded by streets where millions of people pass every day. So that's from a security standpoint. But more importantly, from an urban planning standpoint, you had these 2 very large parts of the city, very populated parts of the city, completely disconnected because the president lived there.
Exactly right. And so what you get is an interesting opening, which took a little while to really come into its own, because when you open a building, you walk into it, I remember doing this, have a little gander, and it's just a building, right? There's nothing there. Turns out infrastructure isn't just the buildings, it's also the means of transportation and the activities and events that you create around them. And that is something that I've really enjoyed over the past few years, over the course of, let's say, the past 5 years in which Los Pinos and then the opening of the other sections of Chapultepec Park to the public have really helped me see. So on one side, you've got Los Pinos, you've got wonderful events there, which I've really enjoyed. But the opening of a funicular that goes from Los Pinos all the way up to the end of Chapultepec Park and beyond has opened up the rest of the sections to people. And it's something Tavo and I did just a couple of weeks ago.
And I was absolutely gobsmacked, particularly because I'd heard quite a lot about this new infrastructure from people who don't much use public transport, but they still have an opinion about it, that it wasn't very good, that it was a silly project, that it just made no sense. And I have to say, they're absolutely wrong. It's beautifully done. It's incredibly well designed. It's incredibly just clean and just top class. And more importantly, it works exceptionally well. Because none of this was planned back, because given that there was very little real urban planning around the way Mexico City grew in that part, in general, getting from point A to point B in and around the park, which has been relatively protected now for a very long time, has always been incredibly difficult. So the street of Constituyentes, which flanks the Chapultepec Park on one of its sides, has always been incredibly famous for being incredibly useless. Once upon a time, it's always had a ton of traffic, but once upon a time it had traffic and it was very unsafe. Then it stopped being unsafe, but it still had a ton of traffic. And a ton of people have to move from the more sort of core part of the city, the original city, up towards Santa Fe, for example, which is at the end of the hills behind Chapultepec. And if you have to go through these roads that were not originally designed for this kind of flow of people, you just sit in traffic forever. So this is great news that this was developed.
And it's one of those cases in which what you tend to see with new public infrastructure is that people need to take a bit of time to get to know it, to create new habits around it. So you see it with the train that connects northern Mexico City proper to the northern suburbs in the state of Mexico, the suburban train, which will eventually, someday, hopefully soon, get to the new airport. But that train, when it was first built, was empty, and everyone said it was a failure because they said no one's using it. Now you can't throw a needle in that bloody train because it's completely full all the time. That was never the case with the cable car because it was full from day one. It is an incredibly useful piece of public infrastructure for transport, but it's also a really good piece of infrastructure for tourism, which is what Tavo and I did when we went up there. We arrived at Los Pinos through the metro, got on the cable car after waiting in a long queue that moved efficiently, but boy, was it long. And then we made our way up the hill. This is past the hill of the grasshopper, which is why Chapultepec got its name, but going further into the newer and less known parts of the park, the second, third, and even fourth sections of the park.
And what I particularly liked about it was that, well, you get to see Mexico City from above in a way that you can't really see it otherwise. But particularly, you get this view of everything that's inside of the Chapultepec second, third, and fourth sections from above. And as we've said, all of this is full of monuments. There's so much magnificent infrastructure that has been built into these parks over the years, over many, many decades. But it was always really difficult to know what was there. So we said it was not that the parks weren't really accessible to people in the past. It's not that they weren't accessible. It's not that they were fenced off. You could always visit the park. You just needed a car. And most people don't have a car. And even if you had a car, and even if you could get there through public transport, which in theory you could, this place is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hectares big. And if you put, a monument in the middle of hundreds of hectares, it's still a long hike. So most people don't really get to see it.
You could start to see that effect taking a toll on those parts of the park because the bits that weren't army barracks started to become more and more unruly. That was something that I saw when I visited it right before it opened, actually. It was a tour that the Secretary of Culture gave to the media across these new sections. It's in the Mexico Political Economist, so do have a look. I'll link it in the show notes. But it was fascinating to see how much work had to be done for a piece of infrastructure that one just assumed is trees and grass. Nothing could be further from the truth. They had to create new ways to get to and over the very rough terrain that made up that park, because the further up you go, of course, the more rugged and mountainous that terrain becomes. They had to get rid of all the rubbish because, of course, if people don't go to these parks because they can't access them, then people start using them as rubbish tips. And once they become rubbish tips, they become unsanitary. And once they become unsanitary, people don't really want to go there and they become unsafe. And interestingly, beyond the insalubriousness and the lack of safety in those parts, one of the big things they had to deal with as they recovered the park, was getting rid of the packs of wild dogs that had taken over the park. We were told in very euphemistic terms that they did an open contracting process in which they hired a company to dispose of the dogs. Now, of course, because all of these dogs were feral, well, I don't think they came to a good end, but they were pretty dangerous animals by this point, hundreds of them sometimes. So no one was going to go into that part of the park anyway. So once they got rid of that, trimmed it up a bit, regained the use of the infrastructure, it suddenly became a usable park again. And what was wonderful was, once you go just a few meters up into the park, what you come across is something that I thought was fascinating. I think you really enjoyed too, which is they didn't reject their past in the same way that maybe Porfirio Diaz would have. He sort of getting rid of everything to rebuild it in a new and modern way. They recycled the old infrastructure. And one of the first things that you got at the bottom of this third section of the park is an old and abandoned water park.
And I thought that was absolutely fantastic, because this water park, which was such a clear sign of the times of the 1970s, extraordinary mega infrastructure projects that didn't necessarily make a ton of sense. So at one point, this water park was famous for, or maybe infamous for, having whales and dolphins living at some of the highest altitudes in the world, because obviously marine animals are supposed to live below sea level. And these were dolphins and whales living at 2,500 meters above sea level. I don't think these animals were having the best of times. But there they were for the better part of the end of the 20th century. And the park closed until 2006. So you had this massive infrastructure that at one point was very popular in Mexico City, but then it just fell into disrepair and, it was completely forgotten. And it had been essentially abandoned since 2006.
But then this new project comes in, and what they do is, instead of destroying this basically tons and tons of concrete where there were wave pools and slides and, all these big spaces to keep a bunch of water, they decided to do something interesting. One of the big issues, of course, was that this part of the park had become seen as very unsafe. It was unsafe because there was crime. It was unsafe because of dogs. But also it was unsafe because the rich in the nearby parts of Las Lomas de Chapultepec, the inheritors of this old industrial class of the 1940s and onwards, they didn't like the sight of something that they thought was revolting, which is working class young people hanging out, loitering, which I think is a crime in some countries. But the government, instead of kicking out these young people as they did the dogs, they did something interesting, which was they said, you can keep this abandoned park as what you were using it for before, which is an open space where you guys can hang out and continue to do what you're doing here anyway, which is skating and just doing stuff around here anyway. And so instead of getting rid of the old pools and slides, they turned them into a skate park. And that skate park is now called El Parkour, which is a wonderful use of the term, El Parque Urbano, the urban park, where graffiti is still the watchword of the day, but it's in a sort of weirdly salubrious space. There's people skating, bulls, and a bunch of other sports that you wouldn't think would don't go well together. And it's a really safe space now. Young people taking skating lessons. I really appreciate that.
I completely agree. I thought it's an excellent piece of urban planning because of so many reasons. So when we went, they had this amphitheater which built on the old infrastructure, and it was a weekend. So the municipality organized free ska concerts. So you had a sort of battle of the bands of different ska bands playing ska for dozens and dozens of people who were just having a lovely time. And then it was really cool that you could see all the old infrastructure for the different animals and where people might have swum. But you could see where the old concrete was and where the new concrete was, because they'd filled in certain parts. And you could see like the little gaps where the water would have left at some point, but now that's blocked off. They left behind, which I thought was interesting and smart, and quite aesthetic in a weird way. They left behind some of the remnants of the old slides. They cut them up in pieces so people couldn't use them and basically kill themselves. But you can still see what the park used to be like, which I thought was fantastic. And the other thing which I thought was great is ultimately Chapultepec has been continuously improved now for over 20 years. In the early 2000s, the park wasn't doing so great because it's always been a place where Mexico City people like to gather on the weekend, but that requires a lot of maintenance. So since roughly 2005, because of a public-private partnership, Chapultepec has been continuously refurbished and refurbished step by step, and it really shows. It keeps getting better every year. But in the second section, which we'll come back to in a sec, which is slightly further east, closer to the center of the city, they had already built a smaller skate park. And when it was first built, it received a lot of criticism. Why would you give space for loitering and so on? And it was a massive success because just south of Chapultepec, on the other side of the Constituyente Street, which I mentioned before, is a famously rather unsafe neighborhood, a much poorer neighborhood, particularly as compared to one of the richest in the city, which is just north of Chapultepec. And suddenly you gave all the young people from this neighborhood a space where they could constructively hang out and do sports. Having had that great success in the second section, the third section just expanded on it significantly.
And I can hear you. I can hear you now. Mexico the podcast. They've sold out. How much has the government paid you to say all this nice stuff about the park? Well, dear listener, turns out no one's paying us, annoyingly. Turns out it is just as good as we're saying, as we think it is. If you want to hear us very heavily criticizing the government, I'll link that particular podcast in the show notes. But I think praise where it's due. I think ultimately this has been a success story. An interesting case where I think you've got to see it to believe it is the fourth and final section of the park, way up the mountain, where they decided to build the latest iteration of now a quite wide network of cinetecas, which is cinema infrastructure, public cinema, where they have arty films and sort of affordable cinema prices that aren't the big companies. And at first, everyone said, what a failure, no one's going up there. What I said people used to say about the Buena Vista train. But when I went, it was a rainy day, and it was still chock full of people, which was lovely to see.
Yeah, it was fantastic, because what I think is great about the Cineteca, it's not just artsy films. You have some more popular films that are in cinemas, but as you said, in more affordable prices. But you also get some of the more artsy stuff, which would be difficult to find maybe, and it's all done in this beautiful architecture. They also have exhibits of old sort of equipment from the film industry across the decades, which is really interesting to see. And something that I particularly liked about where the Cineteca is that this is the newest part of Chapultepec. This is the fourth section, which came in 2021 officially. This is what used to belong to the army. And they had their training grounds there, and you can actually still see some of the infrastructure the army used to use, and you can use some of it. But once again, it made sense to have all of this army infrastructure there when the city ended a little bit below it. But once the city has completely outgrown its original urban planning, it also makes sense to give that back and let the people use it. And it's amazing. It was amazing to be there and have this space that would have, had a few soldiers working out once upon a time, completely packed with people from all ages.
And it's, again, difficult to explain the scale of these places. We were on the cable car. We didn't even get to the end, and we were on the cable car for a good half an hour before we got to this part of the park. And what I thought was wonderful is that even though you've got this massive big cinema complex, you've got outdoor cinema and lots of different screenings, it's still in the midst of this massive park, which is basically, at this point, further up, the far less manicured version of it. If the first section, where the traditional historic section is very manicured and has to close every Monday, don't go on Mondays, people, because you won't get in, but it closes every Monday for the army of gardeners to come in and tend to the plants. Once you've got to the third and fourth sections, it's basically forest, and you can really tell because of all the fauna around there. The amount of fauna that you wouldn't expect to see in the heart of Mexico City is incredible, from these incredible eagles to the different sorts of possums and cacomixtles that you can see rustling around, or at least the evidence they leave behind in the form of feces is, I think, a wonderful thing to behold. And there's a lot of invasive species as well. The most notable, I think, can be seen closer to the first section of the park, and it's not rats, it's not pigeons, it's not dogs, it's not even humans. It's a relatively new species that has really become prevalent all across that part of the park, known locally as El Changuito Mion, which is a little toy felt monkey that people mostly, I'd like to say children, but it's actually grown adults as well, who put these monkeys on their head, colorful monkeys, and they walk around the park with them on their heads, some of which have a little pump and they pee out of their tails like a scorpion. But I guess the technical translation would be something like piddling monkeys. And so you see a rainbow of piddling monkeys, changuitos miones, all across the city, which I think is probably the latest monumental fixture across the park that I can think of.
I mean, these existed before, but not at this scale. And I definitely had to keep it together when we saw more than one couple who were clearly on a date, walking very seriously together, having a serious conversation about whatever, with these little monkeys on their heads and just, pretending it's no big deal.
There's such an important fixture that there are now, this is very meta, there are now monkeys, piddling monkeys, changuitos miones, with changuitos miones on their own heads.
Oh,
I
my
think it's
God.
wonderful. Yeah, it's all very meta, it's all very wonderful, and it's all part of the magic of Chapultepec Park.
So beyond these incredibly important changuitos miones, and of course the first section, the third section, the fourth section, all of which we've covered, we have forgotten all about the second section, which is incredibly dear to me, but I know you're not as big of a fan of it, Alex.
It's a great place to walk around, but it's sort of stuck in the middle now. Hasn't got the wild grandeur of the upper parts, and it's not as aesthetic and historical as the first section. And so you've got this almost weirdly traditional European style park, which of course anyone would be so lucky to have, but I'm just spoilt for choice.
That is true. It is very parky without all of the monumental stuff. You've got jogging spaces and more museums, the Natural History Museum and the space for cultural awareness and so on. But what makes it really dear to me is that I used to live not far from there, and I would walk there with my dog every day, so I'd know every corner, nook and cranny of that place. And there is a particularly special place which I believe everyone should visit, which is El Cárcamo de Dolores. As we talked about in the previous episode, the first part of the Chapultepec Park podcast, managing water has always been incredibly difficult in Mexico City. We get plenty of rain during one part of the year, and then we have no rain during another part of the year. And for this reason, there's always been monumental water infrastructure projects. El Cárcamo de Dolores is one of these great projects from the second half of the 20th century. If you go to the second section, you can still see these massive underground wells. You can walk on top of the wells, and they've got these beautiful sort of botanical gardens of different types of cacti from all over the country. The wells are sadly nowadays empty, but once upon a time, the wells were full and they had fountains all around it, and I still can't wait for the day that they turn them back on. But the particularly special thing is that there is a mural at the end of the infrastructure, where all the pumps were, by Diego Rivera. And it's this fantastic mural where Diego Rivera addresses the importance of water for life in general, but in the history of Mexico in particular. It was not great planning on Diego Rivera's side, because the mural was supposed to be under the water, and of course water wrecks everything. So by the early 2000s, the mural was practically destroyed and it had to be refurbished. Nowadays, there is no more water going through in that part precisely to protect this extraordinary mural, but I can't recommend it highly enough.
Now, if we were a traditional podcast, this would be the perfect moment to wrap it all up and say, we've come back to the beginning. It's water, the life-giving and destructive power of water that made Chapultepec so important from prehistoric times all the way up to the present. But of course, actually, I don't want to talk about that. I want to conclude on the note that I love the idea of Tavo walking around with his dog around a park, enjoying his time, surrounded by piddling monkeys and all sorts of different wild and urban fauna in what I think is probably one of the greatest, not parks, but just spaces in the world. It's a perfect combination of the wild and the urbane. And I had a lot of fun when I last went up there with Tavo.
And on that lovely note, that's it for our two-part series on the wonderful Chapultepec Park.
We'll see you in 2 weeks to talk about something completely different. But till then, I'm Alex Gonzalez-Omrad.
And I'm Tavo Figueroa. And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're talking about Mexico, its history, and everything that makes the country and its great landmarks what they are. Till next time.